thanks to Linda Long, to Karen Massey at the Extension Office, to Jackie Grimaldi, to Eileen Grover, to Nita Noggle, to Nancy Perricone, and Mary Kay Schoenenman for helping me to see this through. So we have all kind of taken some little food topics, and we're going to just take turns talking to you about them, and then we'll entertain questions as well, and if you're still hungry, feel free to eat. So Mary Kay Schoenenman is our next segment.
Greetings, everyone. I'm kind of hungry, so this looks pretty good. I just wanted to tell you a little bit briefly about how we did this. We were assigned recipes that we were supposed to test. So I'm going to come clean today and tell you all I got Rocky Mountain oysters. And I just could not inflict that on my friends who were sitting here. And so I just said, I don't know anything about it. It's the dead of winter. I give up. I'm not going to test it. If someone really wants to know about it, they'll have to speak to someone other than me. At any rate, when I started to think about what I wanted to talk about, and by the way, I forgot my notes, so this is just kind of broad. I happen to have a June 1940 Better Homes and Gardens magazine at home. And I noticed in there how after the war time, things were really trying to get more convenient for the home. And refrigerators were a really big deal. There's a huge ad in there for Frigidaire. And I thought, well, maybe we should go over a little bit of the history and how we got there, because we've really moved pretty rapidly from the days of the ice house, when people cut ice blocks and put them in big, they were almost like an igloo type thing underground, and they stored them in sawdust, seaweed. Did he?
Oh, she did, yeah.
Yeah. And so at any rate, but the ice industry, once it really got going, became a booming business throughout the country, because you had people who would harvest the ice down at the lakes or the rivers, and then you had other folks who were the icemen who went around and delivered them. And one item that I read said icemen, you could always tell who they were because they had very bloodied and cut up and bruised knees and legs from hauling those big blocks of ice around. And then they went around to people's homes. Many people had like a little cutout in their door where the ice could be slipped in, and that block of ice fit in the ice box. And by mid-century being the 1850s, many people had ice boxes in their homes. I've only ever seen them in museums, but the ones I've seen are really lovely. They're oak with, did you have one at your house?
I did not have one. I do remember, I'm from little town in Nebraska, and my grandfather had the ice house on his property. And what all I can remember is them picking up the blocks with the ice tongs, but I remember the fridge from their home.
And the ice boxes, several of which I saw were really nice oak with very handsome handles, knobs, etc. And then the actual liner where the block of ice fit was comprised of either tin or lead. And then they had like a tray that you pulled out and emptied rather frequently as your ice melted.
Yeah, got to empty it right over.
Oh yeah, that sounds pretty nasty. But some of the higher end ice boxes actually had a spigot that you could turn and empty the water out. And one of my really old relatives way back used that ice box for a bookcase, but we weren't allowed to mess with it too much. And I do remember my grandmother saying people weren't allowed to just whip open that ice box at all. It had to be a really serious reason to go and mess around with the ice box.
You better close it fast.
Absolutely close it fast. The ice was harvested from mainly lakes and rivers, but as the industrial times came upon us, the big cities and whatever, the waterways became more polluted. So that led to big companies taking over to produce ice, and some refrigeration as well. Kids used to follow the ice wagon, I guess, way back in the summertime, and they'd take little chips off the ice or have themselves a little snow cone before snow cone was even heard of. Train refrigeration came in the late 1800s when you had train cars with refrigeration, and I read that the beer industry was one of the first industries to really line up with refrigerated train cars so that they could do a lot of transportation throughout the country. Many of you are probably familiar with the old the lettuce fields down in South Routt, south of Yampa. There used to be huge quantities of lettuce produced in this valley. And I found an article from a Chicago newspaper, May 28, 1926, and it was, the headline was from Yampa, Colorado, that the state of Colorado would only be growing 10,000 acres of lettuce that year, as opposed to 12,500 acres the year before. Now that is a lot of lettuce to grow. And then it was harvested, and I think there are old ice sheds still down there, or vestiges of the old ice sheds are still around down off of the highway, off 131 down by Yampa, where a lot of that was loaded onto the trains and shipped out of this area. At any rate, refrigerators came along in the 20s and 30s. They were somewhat primitive, and they were the East Coast was electrified, but most of rural America was not electrified until considerably later. The early refrigerators were pretty expensive, so consequently only the more affluent used the refrigerators. And speaking of electrification, I'm very proud to say my alma mater, the University of Minnesota, December 24th, 1923, along with a fledgling power plant, electrified 9 farms on that Christmas Eve, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. And I also found an article someplace where it said by 1970, 90% of the farms were electrified in this country, which I thought was really a late date, but considering the remoteness of some of the areas, I guess maybe it did take a while for the rural electrification process to come by. At any rate, my favorite story about Frigidaire, you probably all remember Frigidaires. My mother and my grandmother had Frigidaires, and it seems as though they lasted forever. And we'd say, Mother, get rid of that old thing, it's really ugly. So when she finally got rid of it, she put it in the garage where it lived out its life, and she got a more modern refrigerator. But the Frigidaire lasted forever. And the Frigidaire in June 1940 cost $182, so that's kind of a far cry from what they are today. But in the post-war years, everybody, bought a refrigerator, and it changed our lives dramatically because a lot of the milk products that formerly they'd have to cool out in the streams or ice house, ice box, whatever, we could now move forward. The food advances were tremendous after refrigeration. And Frigidaire lasted for a really long time. In 1975, the company was sold to the White Corporation, and then subsequently sold to Electrolux, which is a company out of Sweden. I don't even know if Frigidaire is still out there as a brand. They were amazing. And as the refrigerated train cars crisscrossed America, and of course the beer industry was happy about that, but the meat industry also, and the majority of the meat was processed in both Chicago and Kansas City. So those were huge transportation hubs for refrigerated train cars back then also. Any questions?
You're doing great.
Let's see now. The cookie recipe, when I was looking through the cookbook, I was really interested in some of the old recipes, especially the ones that did not require items in them that required refrigeration. So the cookies that I dragged myself out of bed at 5 o'clock this morning to make were from, thank you. It's a recipe that requires 4 siftings, so I think my arthritis has gone crazy, but I had to have my husband help sift it. 4. You pre-sifted it, then you measured it, and then you sifted it 3 more times along with the Arm & Hammer baking powder and salt.
Flour the way it was back then compared to flour.
Well, that's what we were speculating. It was probably much coarser, and so consequently they made it like that.
Right.
No, but I had the flour all over the place, and I had to get my husband to finish it because my hand was like this.
Was it a honey recipe?
It has honey in it as well. And it also called for vinegar in that recipe, although I elected to use a lemon. And they really don't taste too bad. I don't think I did a blue ribbon.
Which kind are they? Are you talking about? Which cookies?
The ones right there in the white bowl, I think it's called honey nut cookies, and they have walnuts.
They're honey chip cookies, and
Page
they,
350.
the recipe actually came from the Detroit Pioneers Museum and was historically prominent for us because it was from the war years, and they're saying, you know, no sugar, how creative can we be by using sweeteners that are not sugar? So that was part of the reason that that recipe was chosen, but it is, I'll find the page number on it.
Yes.
I have a question. Are these recipes adjusted for the altitude here? This is what you do, or do you still have to adjust the...
I have never adjusted a thing in there. I don't know about Nancy, and I've cooked out of that cookbook quite a bit.
Okay.
Page 350. So these are all from local cooks, so they are adjusted
They
for
should be.
recipes.
This
So
is
yes.
altitude.
Yeah, they're not from someone who lives at sea level. They're there. But on page 350 is the honey chip cookie recipe with a few notes about that whole, you know, war era thing. Right here today.
And you'll notice if you make that particular recipe, the consistency is a lot different than some of the other recipes. And I make a lot of cookies because we have a lot of elderly friends, and I always give them cookies for treats. But it was a little bit different, so I was curious as to how it would turn out. Perhaps it was the honey, and I didn't quite have enough honey. And it was stone at 5 o'clock, so I had to quickly heat it up on the stove and make it honey again. But at any rate, thank you very much for coming today. I hope you enjoy all the food. Cookbooks are a great gift for the holidays, and bon appetit.
Thank you.
You're welcome to have more food. We've got other people coming in. We'd love to have you join us. So our next person who is going to speak with us is Nancy Perricone, and she is a woman of many, many talents. She brought a lot of experience to our cookbook community because we were pretty much rookies, but I mean not rookie cooks, but rookie cookbookies. And so Nancy has been involved with lots of the famous cookbooks that have been done here in Steamboat. So we are excited to have her on our part of it.
Which doesn't make me famous.
For us, she was famous.
Well, I was going to talk today about sourdough, which is something that hasn't changed over the years. We make our sourdough products just like people would have made them here in the valley 150 years ago. I got my sourdough culture from Benita Bristol, a friend of mine. This, not this particular jar, but the culture is well over 100 years old.
Oh, wow.
She got it from a friend of hers in Craig, whose grandmother brought it across the prairie in a covered wagon. So it has lived a long time. It's very dear to me. But anyway, I'm going to pass it around because you kind of can look at it, smell it, get a feel for what a sourdough culture that's a really good culture looks like. Yeah, sometimes the cultures we have in our refrigerators don't look very good, but you know, it is really hard to kill them. I'll tell you how to save them.
I've saved it, it just doesn't look like that.
Sourdough is ancient. As far as we know, they started using sourdough 5,000 years ago in Egypt during the time of the pharaohs. First, they found out how to make beer. I guess that just puts into perspective what's important for humans. Then they figured out bread. It's kind of the same process. It's a yeast that ferments. And so anyway, we have the Egyptians to thank for our sourdough. And most cultures in the world have adapted some kind of a sourdough bread that allows it to rise. Some of them are flat, some of them are bigger, but most cultures adapted this natural way of raising bread, which was much better than just flat, hard cakes. Columbus would have used it on his voyage. When the pilgrims came to the U.S., they would have brought their cultures with them. They were very special. You kept track of them. Mountain men and trappers who would have been in our hills here would have used sourdough to create food for themselves, and they had a lot of other uses for it too. It's very good at shining up brass fittings on rifles. It shines a copper pot. It can be used as glue on anything porous, like a broken piece of china, leather. It'll paste paper together, wood.
Wow.
It's been used to chink cabins. It's an antiseptic. And one of the things that I am sure the mountain men were so grateful for is it was also a source of alcohol. Hooch, if you've ever heard of hooch. This sourdough was just recently freshened, but if you let it sit for a while, it separates into two layers. A layer on the bottom that's solid, and then this gray liquid on top that's called hooch. About 15% alcohol. So it did the job. It's pretty raw tasting, I'm sure. I don't think we'd like to use it for that. But anyway, that is something you can use it for. The miners who traveled to California and up to Alaska, of course, used sourdough a lot. It was very precious to them. And they would often carry their starter, that's the starter, in a bag around their neck, especially in Alaska, to keep it warm because you didn't want it to freeze. And also to keep it from being stolen, because truly this was a way that they could feed themselves. In Alaska, they had porters who were willing to carry their food supplies for them up to their camp, and they charged $1 a pound. So canned goods were hardly worth the effort. Potatoes froze, so a 50-pound bag of flour and a little bit of sourdough could keep them fed for a really long time and wasn't as difficult to transport and a little bit cheaper for them. The pioneers who came through here in their covered wagons, of course, would have used sourdough. The cattlemen, especially when they used the chuck wagon, would make their sourdough into a hard ball. They'd put as much flour into it as they could and make it into a hard ball, and then just store it in the flour sack during the day. You could also work up the beginning of a batch of dough and get your sourdough kind of working and starting bubbling, and then they had a little sling under the wagon, and some people would stick it under there to kind of jostle and blow during the day as they were traveling along. I'm sure there was a bit of grit that got in there. And NASA even looked at using sourdough during the Apollo missions for the astronauts because it is a great source of protein. It has as much protein in it per pound in weight as any other foodstuff you're going to find. So it's a great food. And they were going to make sourdough wafers for the astronauts to have. But crumbs became a problem. They started floating around in their anti-gravity environments, and so they scrapped the idea. But sourdough is a great food product and really good for our bodies.
What's in sourdough?
Flour, water, and then yeast and bacteria from the air.
So where does the protein come from?
The protein, the yeast it becomes an acid, and it eats the carbohydrates and the sugar, and it turns them into alcohol and carbon dioxide. And in this process, the protein is formed. And the carbon dioxide fills up the protein, glutinous protein strands, which is what actually rises the bread. So you can create a starter anywhere. It's going to taste a little different depending upon where you live. There's 3 different strains of yeast that can encounter acidic conditions, so you could get any one of those from the air. And there's 5 different strains of lactobacillus bacteria, which also acts in the starter. So depending upon where you start your starter, it's going to taste a little different. San Francisco obviously has an awesome one, but you can start them anywhere. And once the acid starts forming, then it will prevent bad things from coming into your starter. So it keeps it nice and clean. So around 1900, commercial yeast started being prepared, and I'm sure our forebears were so grateful to have that because it took a lot less time and a lot less care to just open a package or use a cake of fresh yeast. And I know we all do that, I do too. But there's something really special about keeping the tradition alive and kind of remembering all the work and effort that our sisters and brothers went to just feed their family. So I really enjoy using mine a lot. If you're going to cook with sourdough, really the main thing that you need is patience. Before the flour, before the water, before anything else, you need patience. It's a slower process and it takes more time, and a loaf of bread can take up to 24 hours. But you're not busy the whole time. You need to freshen the yeast. You need to make it healthy and starting to grow. So you feed it with flour and water, equal parts of flour and water. Some people put in a little sugar. You can also use honey, something else. But really flour and water is all it needs to grow. And you keep it somewhat warm, and it turns into what was in that jar after about 6 to 8 hours. And it's bubbly, and it's called Freshen the Yeast.
Call me Vanna. 396 sourdough starter, and there are recipes to use your sourdough starter.
And it shows you how to make your own starter in there too.
Yes, in the Fair Family Favorites.
That was a little commercial.
Yeah, sorry.
So then after you've got your freshened sourdough, then you add the ingredients for your bread or cobbler or cookies or whatever it is you're going to make. And then you let it rise again and you bake it. But you don't need any commercial yeast. You don't need baking powder, baking soda. You don't need anything. It does the job on its own. Now, a lot of people, and in our pancake recipe, they will add baking soda to it because it just kind of increases the fluffiness right before you fry your pancakes up. So you can add other ingredients to it. The point is, you don't need it. The yeast itself will do all of the leavening for you. So I find it absolutely fascinating. I've only been baking with sourdough for about 6 years, but I haven't bought a loaf of bread in that time. I store it in the refrigerator. As I said before, it's really hard to kill. You're supposed to feed it every week or two, and once I went 6 weeks and it just bounced right back. You can also dehydrate it. You can make it kind of into a thin paste and let it dry out and break it into pieces and store it in a jar. I have no idea how long it will last, but there are stories of the mountain men scraping their chinking out from between the logs and reconstituting it with water. So my guess is you could probably get it back. And you can also freeze it as a way of storing it. But yeah.
So I've never baked any bread, so I don't know. So how much would you use to bake a loaf of bread?
A loaf of bread takes about a cup to a cup and a half of starter. Now, the trick is with a starter, you don't ever want to use it all because you got to keep it going. So you got to remember to take some out, feed it, which is equal amounts of flour and water, cup and a half, something like that, and then use the leftover for your recipe. You stir up what you're going to save, let it sit for a little bit, and then stick it back in the fridge, and it just bubbles away.
Are you aware of any sourdough recipes using a bread machine?
Yes, I've seen them. I don't have a bread machine, so I haven't done that, but there's no reason it wouldn't work, and I have seen recipes for it. Our library is a great source of sourdough recipes. Beyond the cookbook, please start with the cookbook. But we do have a lot of recipes for sourdough at our local library. Yeah.
So I've had starter in the past that went bad at some point where it starts smelling really bad and it gets kind of gray.
Yeah.
You know, what is that?
Well, if it was the hooch that was gray, you're probably okay. But if it doesn't smell good, throw it out because you've gotten some bad bacteria in there. And you know, sometimes it just doesn't work quite right. You just throw it out and you start over. But it isn't because it's so old. You know, it just has gotten something bad into it. But it's easy to make a new batch.
You may have said this and I missed it, but you pour off the hooch when you're adding new.
Oh no. No, you just stir it back in.
Okay.
And the alcohol, of course, will all burn off when you bake your thing, so you're not going to get drunk from it. But yeah, you just stir it right back in. Part of what gives it its unique and interesting flavor, I'm sure. And not all sourdough is especially sour. Again, some of it depends upon where you live and what kind of yeast and what kind of bacteria you have. Also, how slowly you let your bread ferment can determine how sour it is. But then we also use it for some recipes like anadama bread and other things that are really sweet that you add, you know, flavorings too, so you don't really taste the sourness.
I think we have a coffee cake and a cobbler in the
There's a cobbler.
Yeah.
There's biscuits and bread. There's 2 different kinds of pancakes.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of variety. Awesome. We can't wait for you guys to explore the cookbook and see what that is.
Can you add it to almost any kind of a baking recipe, bread type recipe?
Yes. 1 cup of fermented sourdough like this is equal to 1 cake of fresh yeast or 1 package of dry yeast. So yes, you can replace it in any recipe.
All right, thanks, Nancy. So many times throughout the cookbook process that we were going through, because we did this for years, these are my best friends now. Literally, we spend a lot of time together, and we think alike. We probably made the same things for dinner because we were talking about them at a cookbook meeting. But many times throughout the cookbook process, and even while I'm listening to Nancy talk, I think about the relevance of a cookbook. So, you know, we explored, should we do an ebook? How should we, make this look? Because everyone's going online now. Just Google that recipe, So what's the relevance of a cookbook in today's world? And is a book of recipes now kind of passé when the internet is just the easy go-to for all sorts of recipes? I mean, you can find recipes by celebrities and food bloggers who sound like they spend their lives in the kitchen. And how does that look when we have this cookbook? So I thought about that a lot, and I thought, okay, I use the internet, but where are my mom's recipes? Where are my aunt's recipes? Where are all the things that I've tried and love? They're not on the internet. And so so I brought some of the things that I've used. Obviously, I mean, my favorite recipes are in the church cookbook that I got when I got married, and I cooked in when I was a girl. And this is my first cookbook. My mom sent this to me, and it has Nancy Davis's Spritz cookies. And I'm like, okay, so these are some of the things that I felt like, the Women's Club cookbook from Hayden, and Cattle Women and 4-H collections of recipes. That is where the internet misses out. And I'm not going to be able to Google that and find any of those recipes. On the internet, I can't make a note in the margins because I guarantee you I have marked that my children got a blue ribbon at the fair when they made that brownie recipe out of this cookbook, and that my mom's favorite fried chicken is in here. I've marked that in the margins, and also the cookies that I made today are the Graham's, Grandma's Fruit and Nut Cookies, and in that margin I've added chocolate chips, because cookies aren't cookies without chocolate chips in my world. So, so those are the kind of things that I'm thinking, okay, the internet, while it's great, and my son will be like, oh, don't give me that, I'll just look it up online. And I'll be like, well, you'll miss out then, you'll miss out. So I ventured into the notion then too of the other reasons that we really value cookbooks, and that's really because cookbook is literature. And it's a chronicle of history, and it's a representation of what's going on at any given point in time. These recipes reflect, what culture looked like. So, so literature. I brought my favorite book. It's Huckleberry Hannah's Country Cooking Sampler, and it's one of my most memorable reads because it chronicles the friendship of these 2 women who were raised together, and then they moved away, but they kept in touch through letters. And then after their families were grown and their husbands had passed, they got back together and opened up a cafe where they used their favorite recipes and were friends again. And in the margins of this book are those little stories and letters back and forth between these 2 women. And so this was part of what made me just feel like, oh, I want to write a cookbook that is like that. So I see cookbook as literature. And then I also see it, as history, and so part of the process when we were going through this, people began to avoid me because I'd be like, "Have you got any recipe yet?" And or I'd see them and be like, "I'll email you," So part of that was fine, but we got to the point where we had gotten lots of recipes and we were there, but we really wanted to be representative of all parts of the county. So I spent time hanging out with people in museums, which was really fun. And Linda and I and some other folks in South Routt did our thing. And I came here and gathered and combed through things that might, kind of have a little ski history, that kind of thing. But then I went to the Hayden Museum, and they had the Hayden Women's Club cookbook. And so I bought a copy because they'll make a copy of their historic piece and you can buy it. And I was like, oh, that's so great. Well, then not 2 months later, my mom was downsizing and moving from the ranch to a townhome, and we were going through all of her cookbooks, and she said, oh, this was your grandma's, you should have it. And I looked at it, I said, oh my gosh. This is How We Cook in Colorado, the Women's Club of Hayden, Colorado from 1930s. I said, Mom, tell me about this book. It was the exact same book that I had bought a copy of, but obviously my grandmother used it a lot. My family homesteaded in North Park in Walden, and my grandfather started his Hereford herd from cattle that were Ferry Carpenter's cattle, and that's the connection, is that whole Hayden piece that my grandmother in Walden was cooking from a cookbook with Hayden, and here I was valuing it and bought my own little copy of it. My mom gave me the one that was historic. So that piece to me was like, this is like totally, I'm supposed to be making this cookbook with these wonderful ladies, you know? So then we got to the point where we're, so that's part of it. The other thing that I really experienced as we tested all these recipes, and so we just got the 411 that some people didn't test all the recipes. It's okay. I didn't either, but this was my favorite copy of Fair Family Favorites, because we would print out the latest version and we'd take pieces and say, okay, you test those pages, you test those pages. That piece, you know, to me that's part of the history of this book too, is getting the recipes and testing them. And one of them that I was testing was, we got this recipe for Johnny Mazzetti. And I'm like, great, you know, I'll do that. Well, I looked at the recipe and I'm like, and it's actually from one of the Light family. And I'm like, I'm so confused. I can't tell if this is supposed to be, is it a soup? Is it a casserole? Because you know how recipes in the old days are like, these are the ingredients, bake it at 350. Yeah. I'm like, okay, well, you know, so I did. So I made it, and I thought, okay, so this is the tide of the internet thing. I'm like, okay, I just got to look this up because I don't get it. So I looked up a recipe for Johnny Mazzetti and got the history of it. Well, lo and behold, and I think we put this in the book, that it was kind of a war years recipe that people started. It was started at this Italian restaurant, and it's kind of like, it's an Italian casserole. But when you're from Panama, then you put like green pimentos in it, you know, like whatever. And I was like, oh, so, you know, those are the pieces too where I'm like, okay, well, see, there's value in the internet. It kind of gave me some of the history, and Wikipedia saved me because I figured out Johnny Mazzetti for the thing, and I could, you know, actually, then we added a few helpful hints so that you guys could make it and it would turn out. So I felt like those kind of things are the tie that we have to the internet. So depending on what you're doing, if you're feeding your family, or there's a recipe that you're just like, I cannot find it, I can't tell you the number. Do you remember when we used to write into Better Homes and Gardens and have like, oh, I can't find this recipe for something, could someone share it with me or whatever? Yeah. Well, that's what happens on the internet now. So I think there's a tie to that, and I'm saying, well, you know, using online recipes, it's easy, but it doesn't do us any favors in terms of remembering all those food tastes and flavors and the history of these recipes. So after compiling and typing and testing and loving this piece of Fair Family Favorites, I'm happy to say that I feel, this is my statement, that it's a solid cookbook. It's a piece of literature because there are stories and tales all the way through, and there's a whole historical section in the front. It's a chronicle of times past and what things were available, like honey versus sugar, and now it's a treasured friend that it's my go-to book. I make something out of here. If I'm ever doing it, I make it out of here. So I hope you'll get a chance to meet my friend. We're finishing up. We're saving the best for last here because Linda Long has all sorts of wonderful, exciting things to tell us about the historical piece. And Jackie Grimaldi came in while y'all were kind of here, and Jackie was a big part of our cookbook committee as well. So I just want her to wave her hand, and we'll let her give a few helpful tips. Honestly, you know what her part is? We have that marketing piece for selling. If you have not bought your cookbook from Jackie Grimaldi, I'm shocked because she has put the word out in a big, big way, and as part of the Sharon family, she definitely knows her history piece. So, all right, Linda Long.
Well, I'm sure I'm not the same as the last two, but what I've done is in the back of the book is a section called This and That, and so most of my talk today is about the This and That section, which is right back here. It has on the pages, I've written the pages down, But we have a recipe in there from Catherine Gorley, and I'm sure a lot of you know her, on page 395 for homemade sweet condensed milk. And back in the day, you know, with my grandparents and my mom, there wasn't a convenient grocery store nearby. So if you ran out of stock, you figured out how to make it. So this recipe is on page 395, and it tells you how to make sweet condensed milk. And so if you need to make a pumpkin pie or whatever, we have that in our book for you. And this is what you would go to the store and buy. So I brought in a little sample. This is what you'd be buying if you bought the sweet condensed milk to make some special recipes. So those are the things that were really fun about putting this book together, is that we did get to do a lot of the history of the valley, and all the ladies and gentlemen too. We had a lot of men put in a recipe for us and everything. So I brought that in just to show you that, you know, how neat our book is, that we've got some of this special history inside of it. You can make cough syrup, you could make half liniment, you know. There's a lot of ranchers out here that would still like to do that. So we've got all kinds of old recipes from the old families that they shared with us of how that they got by in those years. So mine that I contributed was homemade yeast. And my grandmother made homemade yeast, something like sourdough, but the recipe is in there and it's on page 421. So if you want to know how to make homemade yeast, the recipe is there. I have never made it myself, but I know that my grandmother and my mom did a lot. So, you know, cornmeal and different things, you know, you don't think about it, you know, but if you don't have it, you have to learn how to make it. So in today's time, you would buy this off of the shelf, but in my grandmother's day, you had to make it yourself. So we have homemade starch. There's a recipe on page 429 for making homemade starch, and they've got some little hints up there that you can do. Today, if you went to the store, sometimes you can find it. Not every, they're kind of getting away from that now too. So we may have to go back to making our own starch. But this is what you would buy today. If you want to follow that recipe, it's on page 429. So you can figure out how to make your own starch. Helen shared. She gave us, the family gave us a recipe for making lye soap. There's several samples in the county, which I don't happen to have one of them, but you can buy on the shelf lye soap. But in their day, you know, when we butchered the hogs, when we did all this kind of stuff, that's when we saved the ingredients to make the lye soap. So those are the kind of things, and that one is on page 427. So all of that is in our book, and it's mostly in the this and that section. And there's a whole ton of all kinds of those kind of recipes that are really fun to look at, that what the grandparents and the parents and everything kind of went through. So we just are so appreciative of you guys coming and sharing this moment with us. Is there anything else any questions that any of you have about any of the rest of, you know, any of the speakers that we have?
I will say one more thing too, that we really do want to thank the Shred of Pioneers for being a part of this process.
Yes.
Because as we looked into doing a cookbook, it wasn't something that one person's pocketbook could have dealt with in terms of what we wanted to do and how we wanted to do it. So we looked to the Shred of Pioneers to be partners with us as we applied for the MOFAB grant, which is the Museum and Heritage Fund Board, and our county values history and the museum piece very greatly, and they actually have some funding that helps with that. So we were able to do, in coordination with the museums locally, we were able to apply for that, and they helped us, along with Yampa Valley Electric. We got grants to help, to start this process and bring this book to you all, and to also do something to commemorate the 100th fair, as well as to raise funds to keep that fair vital and happening for 100 more years. So we really do want to thank the museum for being a partner in that, because we couldn't have done it without them.
questions or comments?
We do have other contributors here in the audience, and we should name them. I think Jean Cohen is a contributor up in the front. We have Janet Selby.
Wait, now you have to stand up.
You have to raise your hand at least.
At least, yes.
Yay. And Janet Selby is a contributor, and so we have that connection. Wanda Redmond is a contributor. Wanda's here. Jackie Bass, she's a contributor as well. Yay. Wanda needs to stand. Let's see if Wanda will stand.
Ruth Ann.
Thank you.
Who in the front, is anybody else up here that and Ruth Ann Newborn is a contributor. She signed my cookbook today. I'm so excited. Let's see, anybody else here that I'm not recognizing? Because sometimes you just get the recipes and not. I think now that I was thinking Mona Kirby, but she's not here. Yeah, so we have lots of people that helped with that, and we couldn't have done it without the contributors, because that was the piece of getting everybody's contribution that made a big difference for us.
Well, I'd like to thank the ladies for coming and giving a really, really great talk from a woman who really can't cook very well. Ask my husband. This is terrific. And the research, the little bit of research that I did in the book to come up with these was really, really interesting, particularly the helpful hints in the back. If nothing else, you just have to get the book and read those. They are absolutely hilarious. And some of them are true. I mean, some of them you look at and go, yeah, you can do that. And others, you know, taking potatoes and making the starch is like, okay, I can see doing that in 1910, but I'll go buy it or something like that. But they really are very, very interesting. For me, the most interesting thing was looking at what women, and I say women because the men were out dealing with the stock, but what women had to do from like the 1900s on to make the family recipes and to cook was unbelievable. Now, all of you tried these, but the question is, did you try them on a coal or wood burning stove? Or, that, and having to go and get the water. No indoor plumbing, no indoor pump. You gotta go down to the creek, or you have to go out to the well and get the water, and you have to milk the cows and then bring the milk in, and just constantly. And then when you were done cooking, then you had to make starch, and you had to make lye, and you had to stand, I mean, it's unbelievable what these women did, and the fact that you guys have collected the recipes is great.
And I think Tamara's point is really good too, because not only did they do that, we didn't just feed, I mean, women in Routt County, you know what our winters are like, they didn't just feed their families sourdough. I mean, they made exciting meals in February when they were lucky to get a hen's egg, they were technologically savvy at that point in time, and when you wonder why women didn't work out of the home, well, they were working their buns off in the home, so it wasn't time for that. So these recipes capture some of those moments that give you the aha. There's a reason there was a job of being a homemaker.
One of the most interesting, it's not really a recipe, it's freezing eggs for the winter. That was very interesting to me because as a city girl, yeah, I grew up, born and raised in Denver. I never had to freeze eggs. You just go to, King Soopers or Safeway. But if you can imagine, it's 1920. You're on a ranch, way out in the middle of nowhere. You have a lot of snow, you have a lot of cold, but you don't have access to a store. But you have to have eggs all winter. And I always wondered how
they did that.
You did that, and they froze the eggs.
How?
And
there's a recipe in the back.
Well, that could be useful today too.
Well, it could be.
If you're going on vacation, you got eggs in the refrigerator, you don't want them away, freeze them, then you can use them when you get back.
And it's a very simple recipe. You take them out of the shell and then you put them with some other ingredients, but you don't stir them, you keep the yolks, and then you just sort of take them out as you need them.
Well, that's what, I have a friend who was Mormon, and they keep stuff for a year, I guess, and she would take ice trays and then crack an egg in each ice tray and didn't add anything to it and then froze it.
Yeah.
But, that's good, for baking, but if you want to use it to fry an egg or poach an egg, no. But that's how she froze eggs.
Yeah, I don't think in January in 1910 you had a lot of fried eggs and bacon for breakfast.
But you didn't have ice trays.
Yeah. No, but they had the freezing in the in-house, so we went on there.
Interesting.
Well, and I'm from South Routt, and we were not we didn't have fresh lettuce.
No.
We never had fresh fruits. We never had, you know, so everybody canned. Everybody
Right,
preserved
yeah.
everything. And like the wash day, that was made out of canned peaches, just because it's the way that we used to make it. And not fresh. I mean, I could have made it from fresh peaches today, but I made it out of canned peaches because that's the way we always did it.
My grandmother made everything. She canned everything.
We canned everything.
And jam, jelly, and they had a huge victory garden and everything.
Right. And that's how we survived, you know, but the
This
ladies
is
were very,
Kansas.
very creative, you know, in keeping the stock at, you know, at hand. But we never had fresh fruit, you know, till 4th of July. We maybe get a watermelon if we were lucky.
But how'd they freeze eggs back then?
Outside.
It's in the cookbook.
Thank you, Jen. Don't tell her, Linda.
Speaking of buying the book, we have 3 of these books that Nancy Mucklow brought. It's Faster Horses, Younger Women, and Older Whiskey. It's a pictorial archive of the Routt County Fair. Go ahead.
There's even a place in here for preserving a husband.
And a recipe for happiness, too. I have plenty of books for you to purchase, and if you buy 2 or more books, I have 3 of these. The first people to buy 2 or more books get this for free. So, thank you very much, ladies. We appreciate it.
Thank you.